Hello, and thanks for joining us on the Wonk. I'm Michael Jacobson, Director of the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance. The Wonk is our new series that examines the urgent issues facing New Yorkers and dives into politics and policy to find solutions. We're kicking off the series by examining one of New York City's most difficult problems. Can Rikers Island be closed? It's a question that has troubled the city for decades. Recently, an independent commission of experts established by the New York City Council called for closing Rikers and released a plan to shutter the island in 10 years. But what will it take to close Rikers Island? Is it really possible? Before we begin, Carol Ann Riddell takes us to Rikers for a close look.
Behind me is Rikers Island, home to our city's infamous jail complex, housing thousands of inmates. In recent history, Rikers has been plagued by disturbing accounts of violence and inhumane conditions, accusations of mismanagement and abuse. Now there are calls for reform, including closing it down entirely.
In some ways, Rikers Island is part of a distant past for Cos Marte, but the searing memories of his time there remain.
It's not livable. It's just you feel like a locked up, caged animal, and you feel like cattle.
Cos, a former self-described drug dealer, is now a successful fitness entrepreneur. He developed his prison-style workout while he was incarcerated and uses the pared-down but hardcore training method to get his clients into shape. And he gives others a second chance by hiring former inmates to work with him. But it wasn't always this way. Cos says he landed on Rikers twice before ultimately heading to prison and then turning his life around.
It's just a disgusting place to live in. Anybody could just like crack your cell open. The cells that we were in, somebody could like crack their door and crack our cells just with a push and a slide, because the machines are so old. Like it's just come in and like radio and beat you up. Yeah, every day was dangerous.
The experience Cos describes of decrepit conditions echoes much of what is documented in a new report by the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform. The commission takes a very clear position on Rikers, saying, closing Rikers Island is a moral imperative. The island is a powerful symbol of a discredited approach to criminal justice, a penal colony that subjects all within its walls to inhumane conditions. We went to John Jay College of Criminal Justice to sit down with Martin Horn, who is well acquainted with the issues at Rikers. Now a distinguished lecturer at John Jay, he previously served as both the Commissioner of the Department of Probation and Commissioner of the Department of Correction for the city.
How would you characterize Rikers today?
I don't think it's any better than it was, probably worse. It's dismal. All that it manufactures is anger and despair.
Horn says the physical conditions on Rikers are a huge problem. He explains the buildings themselves are poorly designed and maintained, adding to the potential for violence.
The radiators, the lighting fixtures are susceptible to being broken apart with people's bare hands and turned into weapons. I mean, I've seen inmates take a piece of a radiator in their cell, a metal fin off what's a hot water radiator system, sharpen it and turn it into a razor that they can slash someone with. I've seen them take the molding strip from around an aluminum light fixture and turn it into a shiv that they can stab someone with.
According to the Commission's report, on any given day, 3/4 of the roughly 9,700 people held in city jails are awaiting the outcome of their cases, almost all because they can't afford bail. 9 out of 10 people behind bars are Black or Latino, and the majority of those incarcerated are housed on Rikers Island.
Behind me in the distance over a bridge is Rikers Island. It's not the easiest place to get to. The trip can take hours. In fact, that's one of the issues highlighted in the Commission's report. Examples? It's difficult for families to visit inmates, hard for service providers and attorneys to see their clients, and for workers to get to their jobs. Then there's the cost of transporting inmates to and from court.
The report cites that transportation cost as $31 million annually to get defendants from Rikers to courthouses and other appointments. And the physical isolation of Rikers Island is more than just expensive.
The fact that the city of New York puts its prisoners there, for the most part, demonizes those prisoners in the eyes of the public. We stop remembering, we forget that the people in jail are our children, and they are the children of our neighbors, and they are citizens, and they have entitlements to rights that have to be respected and protected, and at the end of the day, that they're coming home.
So what is the answer? The Commission's report goes far beyond the recommendation to close Rikers. It calls for reducing the city's jail population and replacing Rikers with a smaller, borough-based jail system located closer to courts. And it outlines other reforms throughout the criminal justice process, for example, around crime prevention, bail, case processing, and sentencing. But as Horn points out, the reality of where to put jails can be daunting.
It's easy in the abstract, but it's very hard in the reality. So it's easy to talk about it, but when you're actually confronted with a specific site, a specific plan, and a specific number of prisoners and community opposition, then it becomes much harder for politicians to take a stand.
A complex problem that will require a complex solution. I'm Carol Ann Riddell.
Joining me are Elizabeth Gaynes, Executive Director of the Osborne Association, which works with people inside and outside of New York City's jails and prisons, Anna Oliveira, President and CEO of the New York City Women's Foundation and member of the Independent Commission on Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, and City Councilman Joe Borelli of Staten Island. Thank you all for being here. And Anna, it probably makes sense to start with you, since you are a member of the commission that we've just heard about, and maybe you could give us at least a sort of high-level overview of the process, the thought process that the commission went through to get to the conclusions it came to.
So the commission worked very intensely for over 12 months, I think about 13 to 14 months. It had a very inclusive process, a very consultative process with all involved, touched in some way or another. Those working in the island, those that had been in the island, done time in the island as offenders or accused of being offenders, their families, legal practitioners, philanthropy, community advocates. The commission really worked in a very, very open way. And very important is that it didn't start its work with the premise or the conclusion that we would recommend closing that particular set of facilities as a way to respond to our local jails in New York City. It got to that process after this enormous examination of data. We had access to very important information. And we ended up making the case on many levels, certainly on a moral level, but also on a financial level, and certainly on an effectiveness level. We realized that the functioning of the whole criminal system apparatus and Rikers Island are leaving us at a place where we spend an extraordinary amount of dollars, where lives are touched perhaps in an unintentional manner, in a very negative way, and where we could see also other opportunities for an appropriate, commensurate report of the criminal system for crimes, as well as we could see utilization of very important resources in New York City with the island itself.
So, Joe, let me throw it over to you, both to get your opinion on this, and also, unlike the rest of us, you're not just a citizen, but you're an elected official, and you'll wind up having a say in how this all transpires. What are your thoughts on this?
Let me comment on the Commission's report and then sort of the political reality that any type of conclusion and recommendation would have to contend with. So I agree with many of the Commission report's findings. What I don't agree with is the recommendation to close Rikers. I believe what you have is a fair and honest examination of some of the conditions on Rikers Island that lead to more problems. But we have, I think because of a lot of social justice activism, we have manifested all of these problems sort of in this image of what Rikers Island is. And Rikers Island is not a jail. It's a 420-acre island with 10 jails. And it's not simple to close that. And I think one of the first problems, though, with the Commission's report is that we don't have a crystal ball. And we're going to estimate that the prison population in 10 years will be half of what it is. I think it's unrealistic to just assume that social conditions, economic conditions, drug conditions, all the conditions that go into the cause of crimes will have somehow changed in 10 years. And I think we run a risk of getting to a point where we've delayed the rehabilitation that was already scheduled to occur on Rikers Island, chasing this dream of closure, only to be left 10 years later with nothing. And I say that more as a result of the political reality of what advocates and elected officials who want to close Rikers will have to face. Even when you look at some of the people in the city council now, those that are in favor of closing Rikers as a matter of policy, when the question was asked or when the sites were located in their district, they were saying, no, the problem's a little bit more complex than that. And this is not a racial issue, because you see members of the council who are people of color also opposing the siting of jails in their neighborhoods and citing the same problems as any other neighborhood would with the redevelopment and revitalization of those areas.
So let me throw it over to you, Liz. You have a somewhat different perspective than the rest of us. You and your organization have been working, as I said earlier, sort of intensely on Rikers for years, delivering programs to people on the island when they get off the island. What's your sense, both of the substance and the sort of politics of the Commission's recommendations?
Well, first of all, the recommendations regarding the changes to the bail and court system that would reduce the number of people who go to Rikers Island and the length of time they stay are right on the money. And I think, and what part of my fear about the close conversation is that it could divert from the focus on the political and financial cost of actually doing the things that would reduce the population. I think it's the notion that closing it is a panacea and that doing some other thing, putting it out there it is, Ronnie Horn is right, it's obvious. It's a mess out there on every level. We have to interview staff who are going to work there and ask them questions like, do you have any special allergies to pepper spray? Because that's a condition of employment there. It's not well managed, and I believe that you could do an equally bad job of managing a system that had 5 borough jails just as well. And so part of what I'd like to see is some focus on, we could pretend that we have 5 borough jails and assign people out at Rikers Island based on borough and see whether that is a solution from that perspective. Visiting Rikers Island is terrible, but visiting the Brooklyn House of Detention is no fun either. The department and the way we think about jails and the people in them require us to think about a humane system wherever the jail is. So I think it's exciting that people have come together to recognize the inhumanity of how we cage people in the city, in the state, and the country. But I just would love us to focus more resources on the front end of it. I don't agree. We can always keep the population at an appropriate level if we eliminate cash bail, if we have speedy trials, even with different changes in crime. Jail populations will always be a focus of numbers of admissions and length of stay, and we have control over at least one of those in its entirety. So that would be my perspective, is focus on the changes to the rest of the criminal justice system that reduces the use of it.
Okay, so let me pick up on a couple of those points and throw it back to Joe and Anna. And I should say I was also, as folks here know, a member of the commission, and I was the commissioner of the Corrections Department in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I want to pick up on this notion of how much new facilities matter. As you know, the commission, myself included, went around and visited some of the newer jails in the U.S. to see what they looked like, because it is true that the facilities, whether they're on Rikers or off Rikers, you mentioned the Borough House, I mean, they're decrepit, horrible facilities. And there are facilities, you'd never build them that way now. There are facilities that are light, that are humane, that are sort of dignified in essence. But I guess the question, Anna, for you is, how much either you personally or the commission think about, how important are the buildings themselves, going into a place that's obviously different, as opposed to, how much of a culture change do you have to do? How much do we have to rethink how we actually do this, the buildings where you do it aside?
It's important not just for individuals who are arrested and placed in those buildings. It's important for those who work in those buildings. And one of the things that was very clear in the work of the commission is that the isolation of Rikers Island is a significant issue. It's not just a question. We would have to demolish everything, create everything in modern. There are modern architecture that allows for a level of experience of those working and those who are incarcerated, of having much more transparency, visibility, safety, just the quality of the buildings makes an enormous difference. There are, one of the subgroups did incredible work at looking at modern jails where the role of staff is different because of technology that is available, because of the way people are housed, as well as the experience of those who are incarcerated. We also, and I need to say this, we heard that from those who represent correction officers, how difficult and unsafe that kind of volume of an isolation and the crossing of that bridge into Rikers Island and what happens is really not helpful. Really fosters that sense of isolation, that culture of violence both ways. A culture of violence is not just towards those who are incarcerated. It's a culture of violence towards everyone. So it does actually make a difference. And I just wanted to say one thing. The commissioner we are not recommending jails in neighborhoods. We're not recommending that. And we are recommending that where there are court systems, that the jails be very near to that they be built in the footprints that already exist, in that kind of civic plaza in that way. That the notion that we have about incarcerating people becomes a different notion. Yes, there are individuals that need to be detained and need to be in a safe space, no doubt about it, but not because they can't pay bails. And in terms of the front end, the closing of Rikers, as recommended by the Commission, is predicated on half of the population that is there now being there.
I want to follow up on some of those points and turn to you, Joe, because your position on this is pretty clear. Yet, of course, just from being a citizen, a public official, the piece we saw on Carol Ann. If we're not going to close Rikers, that still begs the what is to be done question, right? Because I think everyone agrees, as Liz said, there are huge problems at Rikers.
Even I certainly
no,
agree
correct.
with that
So
point.
it'd be interesting to hear, since at least for you, the building a borough-based system is not the answer. What do we do?
Well,
What is
I
to be done?
We should start by giving people a realistic sense of scale. You have the Tombs in Manhattan, which is an 800-bed facility, and it's very large by anyone's standard. We have a blueprint. I know maybe some people might not remember this, but in 1994, the front of New York Magazine ran a cover that said Rikers Island is imploding. Right? We may have.
That's when I was appointed correction commissioner.
So we may have 9,424 assaults on Rikers in 2015, 18% more this year. But that isn't even as bad as it was in 1994. And what we saw over the next 6 or 7 years was a 93% reduction in stabbings, a 75% reduction in assault. The sick rates, the overtime rates, even for correction officers, the cost went down. So there is a blueprint for what more responsive and more accountable management can do to change the shape of an institution. You're talking $11 billion in a 20-year investment. To give you an idea of the scope, the entire capital budget for New Jersey is $1.5 billion a year. That's for all of their colleges, roads, jails. They have 20,000 inmates. Everything in New Jersey is done with $1.5 billion a year. Now you're talking about a $11 billion investment, which would suck up the entirety of the city's capital budget from here projected out. You could not fund this in one capital year. So although we put a timeline of 10 years on this, there's no way we could issue enough bonds to pay for this. So now you're talking, and given the city's capital problems, I wouldn't say 10 years is likely anyway, but you're talking about a generational solution to a problem that exists on Rikers Island today. Most people who are there, who are innocent or guilty, it means nothing. They're on Rikers Island today. The social problems that they face, the violence they face, can't be solved 20 years from now. And that, I mean, that's the biggest impediment, I think, to going forward.
Right. So let me ask Liz, and since I headed the subcommittee that did the financial plan for this, maybe we can get into that in a little while. But let me ask you to take a shot at this, because the fact of the matter is, whether you agree with the commission's recommendations or not, the commission says 10 years, the governor's saying it should take 3 years, but whatever it is you think, it's going to take a while. And in the meantime, or never, depending on your position. But I think we all agree, as Joe said, we have to address these issues now. And so how do you think about that? I mean, you were talking about management. What does that mean in the real world?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, for me, it's sort of both and, right? I mean, yes, I believe Rikers Island should be closed. And I'm responsible for the safety and well-being of the 50 staff people that work there and the 4,000 people a year that we serve coming out. So I can't wait 10 years, 8 years, forget about 3 years. I think that the people that work there should be much more involved, including not just our people, the correction officers. Violence is a problem there, and the real estate is part of the problem, the way that it's laid out. I get all that, and I totally agree that the space matters. But managing it, first of all, much more local management, and all the other jails and prisons that I see in the country, when there's a problem, the person who's the actual warden and the people that are running it are more expert in how a jail gets run. It's a tough thing to manage at that size, and I appreciate it. But you could choose to manage it like it's 10 jails. You could choose to manage it like the jails have some autonomy about how they operate. You could choose to put people in by the borough that they're in so that you're only transporting from borough to borough. You could choose to treat visitors like human beings. It's not, when we talk to our visitors, it's not getting to Rikers Island that drives them crazy. It's what happens after they arrive.
Yes.
It's not necessarily harder to process visitors to 10 jails if you assume that they're human beings and don't complain. It's possible if you have a board of correction that isn't actually the Department of Correction, but actually represents the minimum standards and that holds people to account. It would be fine if instead of just searching visitors with dogs and everything else, that they search correction officers coming in. But I think that there are real opportunities for thinking differently about, in the meantime, assuming we agree on both the front end, having fewer people going in, and altering how we manage it. More autonomy, more incorporating the union in a more constructive way, and working with families and others.
Again, as a commission member, and we sort of struggled with this, how do you balance the sort of vision? And it is a big vision. And again, I don't want to lose the sort of end of this, which is one of the reasons that urban planners are really interested in this, is not just the justice aspect of this, but you get to redevelop a huge piece of property that the city will never see again. But all that said, you have to get from here to there if you ever get there. And, did the commission sort of struggle with what do you do now? This was certainly an issue for correction officers and the union, understandably, right? Their position is, we have issues now. We can't wait 10 years.
For this to work, and I think part of the beauty of the work of the commission and the report is that it has to begin now. All the improvements, the end is predicated on improvements now. It's predicated on improvements in bail, reform, in case processing, in training of correctional officers. We heard how lacking that is, and there are recommendations, strong recommendations on that. So what the idea of the 10 years is that it creates an arc of time for all these changes to take place, and an arc of time for us in the city to reimagine the utilization of that. The commission make important recommendations, as well as the improvement of the criminal system, the improvement of corrections itself, and I'm going to say better yield on human rehabilitation while people are incarcerated in New York City.
why isn't part of the recommendations sort of attractive politically? I mean, all the citing, there are a whole bunch of difficult on-the-ground political issues. But in the end, if you just think about the kind of vision piece that the commission was talking about, you would have a sort of better, smaller, borough-based justice system. And despite, as you say, the huge financial costs up front, we estimate you'd actually save $500 million a year going out. And you'd have this huge piece of land to redevelop at what the commission recommended was annexing LaGuardia Airport and doing infrastructure. But from a high level, it seems like a really attractive piece of urban planning that would pay off in the end. Is that just sort of naivete on my part?
No, I wouldn't say naivete, but I mean, when you look at some of the cost savings you mentioned, if you're still keeping the rate of 1.14 to one inmate, and you're reducing the prison population, whether the population is borough-based or on Rikers Island, you're still getting a significant cost savings. The issue is you're dealing with less than, even with the families affected by this, you're dealing with a minuscule fraction of the population. And when you can't say despite of the cost, because the cost is a real topic. And when people in office have to make decisions whether we're going to put this investment into public hospitals or public housing, I mean, you speak to a council member who may represent a significant portion of Rikers Island inmates. They would probably still prioritize the public hospital or the public schools or whatever in their district over funding a reform of Rikers Island. I agree with you that the buildings themselves are decrepit. You know, there are things that everyone could agree that would modernize the jail facilities, that would lessen the amount of interaction between violent inmates, correction officers, et cetera. All those things should happen, and there's a cost to that too. But you're talking about forcing this. This is why the mayor's gut reaction was right. He heard the price, compared that to how much money things actually cost, and said, this is probably impossible. You're just going to see, as 2021 rolls around, this being a campaign issue for a broader audience, meaning I support Rikers closing, yada, yada, yada. But when it comes down to the brass tacks, you're going to see people distancing themselves from it.
And that, unfortunately, has to be the last word, and not, unfortunately, your statement. I mean, unfortunately, the last word. This is obviously something we can talk about for a while. It's a very complicated issue. It's going to play out in real time. I want to thank everyone here for coming, and thank you again for watching The Wonk. I'm Michael Jacobson, and we will be back soon with more in-depth policy discussions about our city. See you next time. Since we taped our show, the mayor has released his plan on how to close Rikers Island. Like the commission's plan, the big similarities are that he's agreeing to close Rikers Island within 10 years, to house jails in the boroughs, and to reduce the population by almost half. Unlike the commission's plan, there's very little detail on those things, on how exactly we'll get the population down to 5,000, where the jails will be and what they'll look like, importantly, how we'll pay for them, and how much money we'll save from having a smaller system. And perhaps most glaringly, there's no mention at all of what will happen to Rikers Island once it's closed. We'll be following those issues on our next episode of ISLG's The Wonk. I'm Michael Jacobson. See you next time.